They say the smell hit first, not rot, not mildew, but something older, coppery, wet, metallic, like a wound left open in a locked room. The renovation team thought it was mold behind the altar, but when they pulled up the ancient flagstones, they didn't find fungus. They found skulls, not 1, not 10, 113, every one human, every one sawn clean at the crown. But here's the part they never reported publicly. The skulls were hollowed, not in the way of decomposition, but methodically scraped from the inside out, as if something had fed on thought, on memory, on self, and not a single bone below the neck. This happened in 1996 at a monastery so old its records were still in Latin, carved into stone and stained with wax. A place so removed from the modern world that the local villagers still referred to it not by name, but by warning. Don't follow the bells uphill. The church sealed the site within days, labeled it an ossuary, a sacred burial tradition, but monks don't bury each other without ceremony, without crosses, without names. This was not a burial site. This was containment. And what they were containing, what they were feeding, still stirs beneath the chapel floor. Because when the excavators went in, they broke the seal. They opened what the monks had spent 400 years trying to suppress. And that's why you're hearing this now. Because there's something older than the church, older than scripture, something that understands the mind not as a gift, but as a gate. These monks were not saints. They were not even men of God. They were jailers of something unspeakable, guardians of a silence that was never meant to be broken, and they failed. You are not watching a video. You are stepping into the place they tried to erase. From this point on, what you learn may not leave you unchanged. The symbols will start to mean something. The dreams may shift. And when you close your eyes tonight, you may hear what they heard in the final days before the chapel doors were sealed. A scraping sound, like bone against stone. The official church record says the chapel was founded in 1601, atop a hill said to be sacred by local pagans long before the monks arrived. But the deeper you dig, past the archives, past the Vatican records, you start to see the pattern. This was no random location. It sat on a fault line of ritual, a convergence point. The Celts called it a threshold place. The Romans marked it with a black obelisk that mysteriously vanished centuries ago. And before any of them, long before Christianity, there were stories of lights in the earth, whispers that drifted up through the roots of trees and entered men's minds as dreams. When the Benedictine order took possession, they didn't build a place of worship. They built a capstone, a lid. But lids crack. In 1743, Brother Matthias wrote a letter now hidden in the Vatican's Index Librorum Prohibitorum. It was never published, never translated, but a fragment survives, smuggled out by a Jesuit whistleblower in the 1980s. It reads, "We have ceased to pray. It no longer listens. We only hum now, low and steady, to drown the thoughts that are not ours. The walls are not holding. The mind bleeds. The mind bleeds." Let that sink in. The mind bleeds. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. The monks had begun suffering what they called psychic erosion. Thoughts that weren't their own began to fill the silence. Not voices, impulses, foreign, primal instincts. Some wept without reason. Others cut scripture into their skin until only the Psalms remained. And then the disappearances began. No struggle, no signs of escape. Just a monk's robe folded neatly on a pew. And silence. 13 monks gone in one season. One for each apostle, they said. But the real reason was much darker. 13 vessels. Sacrifices. Keys to keep the gate closed. And yet, something got out. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to whisper. The human mies, and, when properly manipulated, becomes a frequency. That's what they were protecting. That's why the skulls were found beneath the floor. It wasn't death. It was storage. Memory as currency. Consciousness as containment. That's what they fed it. And you? You're already feeding it too. With your attention. The skulls weren't arranged haphazardly. They formed a spiral, coiled inward like a serpent devouring its tail. The forensic team dismissed it as ceremonial placement, but to those who've studied forbidden geometry, that spiral is a signature, not a decoration, a mechanism. Each skull had a symbol carved behind the left ear, not random, not artistic, etched with precision, identical strokes, identical depth, like they'd been marked by something inhumanly exact. A machine? No. A consciousness that doesn't forget, and doesn't forgive, and here's where it gets worse. The bone marrow inside those skulls, it wasn't dry. Centuries underground, sealed in stone, and yet still moist. Alive in a way that defied biology. The lab called it anomalous regenerative consistency. But the monks had another word for it. A Latin phrase scrawled in blood in the hidden crypt beneath the chapel's confessional. Vox sanctum venit retro. The holy voice comes back. Now listen carefully. This wasn't just about hiding bodies. It was about harvesting memory. These men weren't killed and buried. They were drained. Not by vampires, not by anything as childish as folklore, but by a living intelligence beneath the chapel that learned to feed on thought, prayer, and fear. The ritual, repetition, every mass spoken, every confession whispered, every kneeling body in silent penitence. It wasn't for God. It was to feed the recursion. That spiral wasn't decoration. It was digestion. Ask yourself, why would a religion obsessed with resurrection be so terrified of memory? Because memory holds truth, unfiltered, undiluted, pre-dogma. And if something can control your memories, it controls your future, your identity, your soul. That chapel wasn't just a place of worship. It was a mental refinery, a psychological furnace built to distill belief into obedience, obedience into silence, and silence into sacrifice. And it worked. For 400 years it worked. Until someone broke the chain. A worker, nameless in the record. He struck the floor with a hammer while repairing a pipe. The spiral cracked open. The smell of blood that hadn't aged. The echo that wasn't an echo, but something remembering itself. And then it began again. You think this is ancient history? Look at your screen. What symbols spiral in your feed? What thoughts aren't yours anymore? This isn't about skulls. It's about what's learning to wear you as a mask. They called it a monastery, but it was never meant for monks. The land itself was chosen long before the first stone was laid. Beneath it ran fault lines, not of geology, but of consciousness. Ley lines, the ancients called them. Veins of subtle power. Every sacred site across history, from Göbekli Tepe to Chartres Cathedral, sits on these arteries, not for holiness, but for control. The architects of the chapel in 1631 weren't building a place to worship God. They were building a transmitter. And the monks? They were never monks. They were keepers, technicians in robes, custodians of a machine older than scripture, a device that uses prayer not as devotion, but as code, repetition, cadence, frequency. Because prayer is not about faith, it's about rhythm, and rhythm programs the mind. Every bell that rang in the tower above was tuned, each toll carefully calibrated to coincide with a specific resonance beneath the floor. That's why the skulls were buried directly under the nave, where the congregation would kneel, where the frequencies would be strongest, where flesh would become antenna. This is why those who attended Mass reported strange dreams, time lapses, a sensation of leaving their body even while awake. The rituals weren't guiding them toward divinity, they were mapping their minds. You see, the most dangerous secret of organized belief isn't deception, it's repetition. The recitation of creeds, the chanting of hymns, the memorization of scripture, not to enlighten, but to erase. Neuroscience would call it neuroplastic induction, but the monks called it something else, oblivium lucis, the forgetting of light. Because this wasn't just a spiritual blackout, it was data extraction. The skulls were not trophies, they were storage units, hollowed out and inscribed to hold entire lives of devotion, trauma, and thought. And once full, our owners were discarded, their identities consumed by the system they thought they served. That's the hidden legacy of Darrington's chapel. It was never holy. It was a node in a global lattice of psychoacoustic machines, disguised as faith. Ask yourself, how many prayers have you repeated without thought? How many creeds, slogans, and pledges have passed your lips? Not because you believed them, but because they were expected. That's the real altar. Your obedience, your attention, and what you sacrifice, without even knowing it. There was one skull, different from the rest, carved with symbols no historian could translate, markings that predated Latin, Greek, even Sumerian, not etched with tools, but seared as if branded by heat not of this earth. When researchers ran it through thermal resonance scans, it responded. The bone hummed, but not randomly, in a pattern, a rhythm, a language. One that bypassed language centers in the brain and triggered the limbic system, the seat of emotion, instinct, and fear. Those who listened too long described visions, a chapel with no ceiling, a sky that blinked, and figures without faces kneeling in perfect silence. One archivist went blind within minutes. Another tried to burn the skull. It wouldn't ignite, it pulsed. The monastery was decommissioned in 1894. Or so the official story goes. In truth, it was sealed, purchased quietly by an unnamed heritage trust, whose board has no public record. The chapel was filled with concrete, the crypt flooded with mercury, and for over a century, no one touched it. Until now. Because 2 years ago, a storm collapsed part of the western foundation, and beneath the rubble, something began to pulse again. Not light, not heat, but sound. A sound no one wanted to hear. You see, the system was never truly shut down, only buried, deferred. Like all control systems, when they outlive their usefulness, they are not destroyed, merely repurposed. Because control, once perfected, is never wasted. And now that sound, that signal, is spreading. Through shortwave radio stations that broadcast only numbers, through abandoned YouTube channels with looping Gregorian chants, through sudden nosebleeds, blackouts, and déjà vu in men who've never even left their town. It doesn't matter that you've never visited Darrington. You don't need to. Because the new lattice is digital, and the prayers are algorithms. Every scroll, every click, every looped video you fall asleep to, is a ritual, not ancient, not sacred, programmed. Now I want you to prove you're still awake. Comment the phrase, "The silence contains the code" below. Not once, but twice. Once for who you were, and once for who you are now. This isn't superstition, this is a declaration. Because the moment you wrote it, the system registered your disobedience. And now, it knows you've heard the signal too. What was hidden beneath that chapel wasn't just 113 skulls. It was a blueprint. A framework for influence, perfected in the shadows and tested on those monks not as victims, but as volunteers. You see, the greatest lie ever told is that evil forces act against our will. In truth, they ask for consent. Twisted, buried, manufactured consent. but consent nonetheless. The monks wanted to surrender. They thought it would bring them closer to God. But the God they found in the silence wasn't divine, it was architectural. A sentience not of heaven or hell, but of design. It gave them structure, order, purpose. It gave them rules so precise that their thoughts eventually obeyed without question. That's not devotion. That's behavioral compression. And once it worked on 100 men locked behind stone and candlelight, they knew it would work on the masses. They didn't need to bury skulls anymore. They needed to bury ideas. So they built schools, cathedrals, courts, not to spread knowledge, but to replace the inner voice with an outer command. And over time, we began to feel guilt, not from conscience, but from compliance. Every system you've ever trusted, education, religion, law, has a lineage. And it leads back to that chapel floor. The same geometry used in Gothic arches appears in military psyop symbols. The same ratios used in stained glass appear in corporate logos. And the chants those monks sang before their disappearance, nearly identical to modern brainwave entrainment tones marketed as relaxation tools. But there is no rest in resonance, only submission. And when you realize that, truly realize it, something begins to unravel. You stop feeling safe. You stop feeling watched by anything human. You start to hear things, not voices, but frequencies that shape thought before it becomes language. And then the world turns. Because it always has in turning. Not toward freedom, but toward optimization. Predictability. Silence. Not the silence of peace, but of calibration. That's why the skulls were hidden. Not because they were relics, but because they were proof. Evidence of an ancient program that learned how to embed itself in flesh, culture, and now, code. What you feel right now, that discomfort in your gut, that's not fear. That's the system recognizing your awakening, and it does not like to be seen. You were taught that history is a series of events, wars, kings, revolutions, inventions, but that's not how power moves. Power moves through continuity, not chaos. Through symbols, not swords. Through obedience that feels like choice. And the chapel, the monks, the skulls, they were only one node in a vast neural map designed to train the species to kneel before patterns we can't even perceive. Because the most dangerous control isn't physical, it's spiritual. Ask yourself, why do men walk into churches and feel awe? Why do we instinctively lower our voices in cathedrals? It's not reverence, it's resonance. Architectural frequencies tuned to subdue, to suppress, to align the body with systems it doesn't remember consenting to. Those monks were the first tuning forks. Their prayers weren't to God. They were calibration codes. And once their bodies broke under the pressure of obedience, they were buried with the frequencies still echoing in their skulls. That's what you don't understand yet. Thought leaves a residue. It's measurable, transferable. The bones remember. And when those skulls were removed from the chapel floor and tested in secret labs across Europe, something happened. Every researcher involved in the autopsies either vanished, suffered psychotic breaks, or became obsessed with geometric order. One man spent the last year of his life drawing the same 7-pointed symbol over and over, not knowing it matched the chapel's layout perfectly. 7 chambers, 7 rites, 7 tones. The number wasn't religious, it was mechanical. A design forged long before the chapel, long before Christianity, from the cult temples of Çatalhöyük to the desert monoliths in Sudan, all tuned to the same cognitive code, one that opens the mind, not to liberation, but to interface. And here's the horror. You're already part of it. By hearing this, you've accessed input. You've allowed the signal in. That itch behind your eyes right now, that's not discomfort. That's decoding. So now I have to ask you to make a choice. Not for me. For you. If you understand what's being done to the human mind, and you refuse to let it continue, comment this phrase now, twice. I withdraw consent. Not because it breaks the system, but because it identifies you, to those watching, to those resisting, and to the ones still buried beneath the floor. There's a reason the skulls were buried face down. In ancient ritual burial, this wasn't punishment. It was containment, a way to silence what should not speak again. Because those monks, they didn't die ordinary deaths. They weren't executed or poisoned. Their spinal columns collapsed inward, as if gravity itself changed for them, as if they were pulled down, not metaphorically but physically, by a force rooted beneath the chapel. Something not content with worship, but craving submission. It's called an anchor field. A gravitational anomaly created when repeated ritual, belief, and blood are focused into one place over centuries. Think of it like a psychic sinkhole. A place where human will is slowly eroded. Not instantly, slowly, over generations, until the people in that place stop resisting, stop questioning, stop dreaming. And that's what was happening at the chapel. That's why the monks' writings became more abstract with time. Why their eyes began to turn inward. Why they wrote verses in spirals instead of lines. The field was working. Their free will was degrading. They weren't men anymore. They were receivers, vessels for the will of something older than doctrine, something that doesn't need armies, only obedience. That field, it still exists. Buried, dormant, but not gone. In fact, versions of it exist all over the world. Ever wonder why some buildings make you feel less? Why you walk into a bank or courthouse or government complex and feel your spine straighten, your voice lower, your thoughts blur? Those are synthetic anchor fields, modern versions of the chapel's design. You thought architecture was just design. It's not. It's programming, spatial programming. Because when space is shaped a certain way, thought follows. They learned this in that chapel. And the reason those 113 monks were buried under the floor wasn't reverence. It was reinforcement. Their bones became part of the structure, the frequency locked into calcium and decay, a living, dying circuit. That's what this all is. A circuit. The world you live in is wired, not with copper, with belief, with memory, with ancestral obedience. The chapel didn't collapse, it was decommissioned, because something even more effective replaced it. And the skulls? They weren't evidence, they were keys. You see, when a mind is broken, it leaves behind residue, not blood, not bone, but thought patterns, psychic impressions. That's why those 113 skulls weren't scattered. They were placed in specific arrangements, aligned like antennas, as if tuned to a frequency most people can't perceive, until it's too late. This wasn't religion, it wasn't madness, it was signal work. The monks weren't just praying, they were broadcasting. Daily chants, whispered mantras, repeated rituals, all to activate something that spoke not with words, but through suggestion, through dreams, through compulsions so subtle they felt like your own thoughts. Do you understand what that means? Every habit you've adopted without knowing why, every fear that makes no logical sense, every time you stopped yourself from acting, from speaking, from changing, it could be residue, carried across time, passed down in silence, reinforced in architecture, amplified by collective belief. They don't need to control the masses, they just need to build the right echo chambers and wait. Because the truth is, humans are programmable. Your father was, his father before him. Whole bloodlines, walking antennas, carrying viral thoughts implanted generations ago, and some of those signals, they trace back to this chapel. Why else would a forgotten building in the Alps have symbols matching sites in Guatemala, in Mongolia, in the Dead Sea caves? There is a lineage of control, not through language, but through resonance, through the manipulation of spatial energy, ritual timing, and above all, silence. Because silence is never empty. It's compression. It's pressure, and pressure creates shape. Shape creates thought. Thought becomes belief. Belief becomes obedience. That's the secret the monks died to protect, or maybe to preserve. This wasn't about hiding the past. It was about keeping it alive. You can still hear it, if you know how to listen. In the patterns of your own routine. In the hum behind fluorescent lights. In the way certain buildings make your dreams change. That's not coincidence, that's tuning. And this video, this moment, you've just become untuned, unlinked. So if you're ready to sever the old signal, comment below. The silence was never mine. Comment it twice, lock it in. Because once you see the wires, you don't go back. You either follow them, or you cut them. But what happens when the signal is interrupted? That's what the order feared most, not exposure, but disruption. A single man seeing clearly is dangerous, but 1,000 men, unplugged from the pattern? That's a catastrophe for those who built the web. And it's happened before. The lost sects of southern France, erased in blood. The desert ascetics of Mesopotamia, vanished in sand. The shapers of Irkalla, the echo cult of Priaxum, the nameless school of Thessaloniki, all wiped out within months of discovery, because they found it. They found the architecture beneath behavior, the structure behind belief. And when they tried to break it, to live free from it, they were silenced. Not just physically, spiritually. They were buried under layers of ridicule, heresy, academic dismissal, turned into myths, cartoons, or worse, forgotten completely. That's the real danger of knowledge. Not that it's destroyed, but that it's diluted. You're taught to forget by replacing the signal with noise, endless scrolling, sensory overload, manufactured outrage, fake choices. You were never meant to ask why certain numbers repeat in architecture, why cathedrals match star patterns, why Gregorian chants align with your brain's theta rhythms. You weren't supposed to look under the chapel floor, but now you have. And I need you to remember this. Those skulls weren't just arranged. They were interlinked. Some of them had been fused, melted almost, as if by exposure to extreme heat or radiation, but no fire had touched the stone. The scientists who examined them in secret filed a report titled simply, Temporal Collapse Risk. Temporal, not spiritual, not biological, not even paranormal. Temporal, as in time. The monks weren't preserving the past, they were anchoring it, holding something in place, a pocket of influence, a ripple of control, a fracture in reality itself. If that breaks, if the alignment of skulls is disturbed, as it was when the floor was dug up, then the signal doesn't just stop, it reverses, which means the pressure is building again, not in sound, not in soil, but in minds like yours. And those who disrupted it, they've already begun dreaming things that don't belong to them. You may be next, and if you are, there's one rule. Never answer when you hear the bells. There's a reason the monks sealed the chamber beneath that chapel with more than stone. They sealed it with ritual, with geometry, with sound, because what they were guarding wasn't just a relic. It was a convergence point, a resonance site. One of the very few places on Earth where perception and reality overlap so precisely that even thought can take form. And when thought takes form, it can be fed. Understand this. Belief is not harmless. It's the most dangerous force ever harnessed by man. Belief shapes nations, topples empires, births gods from nothing. And in Darrington Hollow, or beneath that monastery, or in the dust-covered ruins of every civilization that was mysteriously wiped from history, belief was engineered. This wasn't faith. It was architecture. Invisible, immovable, ancient. And those 113 skulls? They were anchors, not just of memory, but of containment. The monks didn't bury them. They arranged them with mathematical precision. A lattice, a living circuit. Every skull a node, every mind a terminal. And together, they held something in. But now they're broken. Scattered, catalogued, put in boxes and glass cases by men in white coats who didn't know what they were holding. Or worse, men who knew exactly what they were doing. And so the frequency returns. Slowly at first, like a hum under the skin. Dreams you can't remember but wake up sweating from. Faces you've never met, but feel guilty for forgetting. That growing sense that something's watching, not from the shadows, but from within. That's how it always begins. And when it fully reactivates, when the lattice reforms, not in stone, but in minds across the world, it won't be the monks who speak first. It will be the ones they were trying to keep silent. The architects of resonance, the old voices that designed entire ages of human history through symbols, liturgies, and rites, them as hidden beneath language. They were buried once, not by time, but by intention. And if you're hearing this now, it means the veil is thinning again. So I'll ask you one last time, to mark the threshold, to lock in your awareness. Comment below. I heard the signal. I remember the soil. Write it twice. Speak it once. Think it always, because the doors are opening again. And soon, memory won't belong to you. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of something older than words, older than the bones beneath that chapel, older than the first name ever carved into stone. Because what the monks tried to bury, what they died to silence, wasn't a secret. It was a cycle. One that always returns when memory gets too loud, when history begins to glitch, when men like you start asking the wrong questions at the right time. You were taught to trust your senses, to believe in dates, in facts, in timelines wrapped in ribbon and sealed by government stamp. But deep down, you've always felt it, haven't you? That something's off. You can't name it, but you can feel it. In architecture that doesn't make sense, in religious texts with missing pages, in wars fought over ruins no one dares to translate. You see it in symbols that repeat across empires with no connection. The spiral, the twin pillars, the black sun, recurring images that predate language, but echo something real, something that was once awake. The chapel was just one node, the skulls were just memory devices, but what they held was pattern, and that pattern wasn't dormant. It was sleeping, waiting for resonance, waiting for modern minds to be softened again, by distraction, by noise, by submission. And now we carry more resonance tech in our pockets than any monk could have imagined. Frequency is no longer sacred, it's weaponized. They no longer need bells or choirs, they have algorithms, push notifications, Light pulses designed to mimic the same rhythms used in the chapel floor. And that feeling you get when scrolling, that trance, it's not an accident. It's ritual. And you are the vessel. But you've heard this far. That means something in you is immune, or at least, unbroken. So I'll give you this truth. Not to scare you, but to arm you. History isn't what you were taught. It's a prison. And the only way out is to remember what they buried beneath the soil, behind the sermons, and inside the skulls of men who were never meant to speak again. So listen carefully. The silence isn't empty, it's full of answers, and they're listening for you too.